In this second session, I know we have some new folks in who weren't here for the first session. In that first session, we did primarily a textual study from 1 Chronicles 22, using an incident from David's life as an example for us and things that we need to think about as parents. Now, in the second session, I want us to talk about some practical things. And, you know, it is absolutely impossible for us to talk about all the things that we'd want to talk about. I mean, we could do this ongoing without end and never get around maybe to all the things that we wanted to talk about, but there are some things that I think are very primary and very foundational that need to be said. And so, let's see, we have some new folks. Did everyone get the handout? Everybody have the handout?
The second one, we're having some more run off.
Okay. So the back of the first one has session 2. So just want to be sure you get the blanks filled in. Number 1. This is important. After you write it down, underline it, put a star by it, exclamation points after it. Be the parent. Be the parent. The biggest mistake that I see being made by young parents is failing to be the adult, failing to be the authority, failing to be the one who establishes the boundaries and enforces those boundaries. When Joshua said, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord," That's establishing some boundaries. That's establishing parameters in which his family was going to function and operate. And anytime you set boundaries and parameters, they're going to be tested. And when they're tested, are they going to stand? And if they're going to stand, it's going to depend on you as a parent as to whether or not they do stand, because you either make them stand or you let them fall. It's the job of a parent. Interesting thing about children. They seem to have innately born within them the need to test the boundaries. They want to know where they're at. And if you don't have those boundaries clearly set, that they clearly understand, then you're doing them a tremendous disservice. Young lady that I dated my sophomore year of high school. I'm very, very grateful that I dated Sandy, because her best friend was Tanya. But I'll never forget something that Sandy said to me. Sandy came from a Christian family. And Sandy was actually the one who first invited Tanya to come to church. But by our senior year of high school, Sandy had dropped out of school. We had an encounter with her a few years later. She had several kids by several different men. But one thing that Sandy said at one point in time that I will never ever forget. She said, "I wish my parents would one time tell me no." No boundaries. None. As parents, we have to set those boundaries, and we have to enforce those boundaries, and then we have to mean it when we do it. Which means that in the process that we're going to have to provide meaningful discipline. Meaningful discipline. And the same discipline does not work the same for every child. I hate to use our own kids as examples, but it's the only ones I've got. So that's my parenting experience. 6 years difference between our kids, and they were as different as night and day as infants and toddlers. In that Alyssa, you just look at her crossways and she just fell apart. Just absolutely fell apart. I think that she received very, very few spankings. Dalton, on the other hand, he was the boundary tester. It didn't matter what it was, he was going to test the boundary. Just one story, I'm sorry. Was helping coach Alyssa's fifth grade basketball team, and Dalton wanted to sit down on the bench with me, and so we sat down there on the bench. He was sitting beside me, and right in front of our feet was the out of bounds line for the ball court. Dalton would get out of his chair, and I said, Dalton, back over here. You see this line right here? You don't cross the line, okay? You've got to stay on this side of the line. Dalton being Dalton, a few minutes later, I noticed, had hopped down out of his chair, and he had gotten his toes right up to where they just crossed the line. And what he was saying, whether he cognitively realized it or not, was, okay, Dad, what are you going to do? And that's what our children are telling us when they test the boundaries. Okay, what are you going to do? Parents, be the parent. Enforce the boundaries. Yeah. Sometimes you hear, particularly with the little ones, a hesitancy to discipline. Well, they're just so young, they don't know any better. It's a true statement. They are so young, they do not know any better. But guess whose job it is to teach them better? That particular behavior or activity is not appropriate, it is not correct, and quite frankly, it's not going to be tolerated. Who is going to teach them better? It's your job. Be the parent. Proverbs chapter 29 and verse 17, correct your son, and he will give you comfort. He will also delight your soul. Our kids, somewhere around, middle school, junior high, did a flip-flop. That's just, an absolute flip-flop. And all of a sudden, Alyssa became the one who tested the boundaries. And Dalton, who's now 17, has become the one that if the thought ever remotely entered his mind that he disappointed his mother, that could be the worst possible thing in the world for him. Have to set the boundaries. Parents are reluctant to do that a lot of times because they are afraid. They are afraid that their children will not like them. They're scared. Well, let's get over the fear, because that's an unrealistic expectation, because your children aren't supposed to like you, but they are supposed to respect you and honor you. And sometimes that may mean that they're not going to like you very much. But fear of being not liked by your children is unwarranted. And it's not valid. Proverbs chapter 29, before I get to that. Parents who are afraid their children won't like them very often become ones whose actions are dictated by what the child wants, how the child feels, or fear of what the child might do or say. I want to ask you a question. Who's running that family? The child is running the family. Proverbs 29:15, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child who gets his own way brings shame to his mother. David's advice to Solomon in 1 Chronicles 28 and verse 10 was, be courageous and act. Parents, be courageous and act like a parent. There are some challenges that parents face today that I am thankful that we did not have to face as parents. And these are very recent. We have a 17-year-old son, so some of these things are just really coming on the scene that may the Lord be with you as you deal with these things. In 1960, the top 3 influences on a student's life, that is a school-age child's life, were number 1, parents, number 2, teachers, number 3, spiritual leaders. Gallup poll 2008, I'm in the wrong century here, 2008, the top 3 influences in a student's life, number 1, friends, Number 2, media. Number 3, parents. Spiritual leaders. Number 17. Parents have a tremendous responsibility in regard to the influences that are brought to bear on their children's lives. And it is a whole new ball game. Number 1, friends. Number 2, media. With the advent of the cell phone and texting, your children's friends now have unlimited access to your child. Unlimited access. With the advent of the internet, without very specific guidelines, then anything and everything, and I mean that literally, anything and everything is at your child's fingertips. When I grew up, there was one telephone and one television in our house. The phone was attached to the wall with a cord that you couldn't stretch very far. And so when a friend called, my parents knew that I was talking to that friend. They heard half of the conversation, whatever I was saying. They knew how long the conversation lasted. They knew what was going on there. My parents were concerned with my friends. One young man from my school whose grandparents lived in our neighborhood, and I wanted to go play ball with them, and my mother had great reservations about that. David, I just really don't think that you ought to be playing with Scott. And in my brilliance, I think I was in 5th or 6th grade, I told Scott that. That was a smart move. But the point is, you have a responsibility regarding the influence that your children's friends bring to bear on them, and their friends have access to them that is unparalleled by any parents up to this point in time. The television we had in our house got 3 channels, and it was black and white. There wasn't the cable, there wasn't the Dish Network, there wasn't all of that stuff out there that's on broadcast television today that is now so easily accessible. Think twice. Think 3 times. 4 times about the influences that are being brought to bear on your children. And be ready to take some control. To take some control and to set some parameters. And be ready for your child to be thoroughly upset with you. I want to tell you something. Your child is worth fighting for. And don't be afraid of the fight. I told the story in the first hour about the young mother who lost control of her daughter in the floodwaters. And don't think it's no less serious and no less dangerous than it was literally for that young mother. Because there is a world out there that is ready to tear your children away from you. Be prepared to fight. Tanya and I received a phone call and email from some friends of ours who were having some difficulties in regard to their teenage daughter, having some very similar experiences that our own daughter had encountered. And they were familiar with some of the struggles that we had gone through. And our message to them was, you fight. You fight for your daughter. You don't just turn her loose. You got to fight. One of the things that has recently come to my attention, and I'm not necessarily always up on the latest things that are going on. We're back to cell phones now. Sorry. That's kind of an awkward transition. I was made aware of this from a blog, Robert Prater's blog. Robert was here earlier and he left. I said, Robert, I'm going to refer to your blog in the next session. You better stick around. But he left anyway. But he was referencing an article that had appeared in Forthright magazine, which is an e-magazine, an e-zine they call it, that is written by Brotherhood preachers. But are you familiar with not texting, but sexting? Through the sharing of pictures from cell phones and video clips from cell phones of explicit photographs that girls are sending to their boyfriends and boyfriends are sending to their girlfriends. And lo and behold, those pictures are being picked up and posted on the internet. Your children have unlimited access, or others have unlimited access to your children through that cell phone. And the potential here is absolutely devastating. I had a conversation earlier this week with a gentleman who has been out of federal prison for 1 month. He's a friend of mine. He spent his time in federal prison because 2 years ago he sent what was deemed an obscene photograph over the internet. It's a federal offense. It is a federal offense. And what these kids are doing, sending these pictures on their cell phone, is a federal offense. As a matter of fact, Chuck told me, he said, now, my crime came under the lower statute. What these kids are doing falls under the higher statute, the more severe crime. They're committing a federal offense with this, but that's not even the worst part of the problem. But let's understand that as parents, we have to set parameters, and that is so challenging for us because of the accessibility of our children to the world and the world to our children. It's a very serious concern and very serious issue. As you as a parent conduct yourself as a parent in teaching your children, what you are teaching your children is so significant. You're teaching your children obedience. And we cannot even begin to emphasize sufficiently the importance of your children learning to obey. Because children who do not learn to obey their parents are going to find it exceedingly difficult to obey God. The home is the training ground of our relationship with God. And if our children do not learn to respect and honor and obey their parents, they're going to have an awful tough time learning to honor and respect and to obey God. But children who have learned to manipulate their parents to get what they want will become adults who can only conceive of a God that will give them precisely what they want and when they want it, because they can manipulate Him as well. Our children are not above Jesus. Luke chapter 2, verse 51. And He, Jesus, went with them, His parents, and came to Nazareth, and He continued in subjection to them. Jesus continued in subjection to Mary and Joseph, His parents. Jesus, the Creator of the universe, the Sustainer of all things, knew that God's intent was for Him as a son to be in subjection to Mary and Joseph, His parents. I wonder how important that is to God in regard to our children, that they be in subjection to their parents. As a parent, you are the teacher. We're going to come back to this point here in just a little bit, time permitting. Being a parent, by definition, makes you a teacher. I remember a comment made by Charles Barkley several years ago. Charles, he was a pretty good basketball player. He seems to be even better at sticking his foot in his mouth. But he came out one time and said, "I am no role model." Sorry, Charles, but you are. Because of who and what you are. You are a role model. And as a parent, you are a teacher. You absolutely are a teacher. And our children learn from us at very intimate levels. One of the little children that Tanya is babysitting now is little Avery. And I remember several months ago, just when Avery first started to learn to walk, she would walk around the house and she would have in her hand one of the toys from the toy box, which includes some of our old cell phones that don't function anymore. And Avery's walking around talking on a cell phone. I wonder where she learned that. Our children learn at very intimate levels. They learn from us our very expressions. You know, we're not talking about a formal teaching situation. Okay, now, child, we're going to learn this today. But they're observing us every day and they're watching us every day. They're learning, they're learning, they're learning, they're learning. And we are teaching, we are teaching, we are teaching, we are teaching. Just by the way we go through our everyday life. We don't sit our children down and say, okay, now, when you get surprised, I want you to raise your eyebrows like this. We don't say to them, okay, when you get angry, here's a special set of vocabulary words that I want you to use. But they learn all of those things, don't they? Because you as the parent are the teacher. Fathers have particular responsibility in this regard. I'm trying to hurry on. Ephesians 6:4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but to bring them up in the discipline and the instruction of the Lord. We're familiar with the Old Testament passage of Deuteronomy 6 about teaching your children. And God repeatedly gives that instruction of parents, teach your children. So what did God do that would happen? Wanted the children to learn these things. He didn't set up Sabbath school. Okay, we're going to organize a Sabbath school and we're going to have these classes. They're going to be divided by ages. We need a Sabbath school director and we're going to put all of our kids in these classes so they can learn these things. How does that text go on to talk about that? Fathers, you talk about these things with your children when they rise up in the morning, when you're walking in the way. You teach these things to your children. That's God's plan, and it is still God's plan. And fathers have particular responsibility in that regard. Several years ago, it's at 1997 in the Christian Chronicle. This is a dated survey, but I've not found anything like it since then. It was done by 3 university professors from Churches of Christ, reported a portion of their findings of a 10-year study from a list of 30 to 40 predictors of adolescent spiritual maturity. 30 to 40 predictors of adolescent spiritual maturity as related to their fathers. Number 1 on the list, dad as a teacher. Number 1, 10-year study. Adolescent spiritual maturity. Dad as a teacher. Parents, we need to clearly identify the goals of our child's spiritual development. That's session 1. Session 2. Which is number 2, by the way. Clearly identify the goals of you want your children to achieve. There is a list. It's a handout that we're not going to pass out. We're not going to take the time to do that, but it is on a sheet that's available on one side of the sheet. A parent's spiritual goals for their child. This is adapted from Michael Ferris's book, What a Daughter Needs from Her Dad. Very good book. Dads of daughters, read this book. But this list of spiritual goals for my child. My child will be sure of his or her salvation. My child will love and understand God's Word. My child will know and willingly obey God's rules of right and wrong. My child will know his or her individual gifts and call from God. My child will be able to teach spiritual truths to others. My child will be an effective witness. My child will spend daily time with God. My child will do acts of service of good for others. My child will exercise self-discipline. My child will be in fellowship and under the authority of a local church. My child will understand the power of prayer. My child will be maturely walking with God. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Maybe the first place we need to start is with ourselves and how we're doing with that list. But you've got to have an understood and defined goals of what you're wanting to accomplish with your child. Now, how are they going to go about achieving those things and accomplishing those things? And who is going to be responsible for getting them there? That's going to be you. I want to move on because I want to spend some time with this point because it comes back to something that we've already talked about a little already, and that is number 3. As a parent, you need to be a teacher. Number 3, be a teacher. Psalm 78. I want to take the time to read these verses at the beginning of Psalm 78. Listen, O my people, to my instruction. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told to us. And we will not conceal them from their children, and tell the generation to come of the praises of the Lord and His strength and His wondrous works that He has done. For He has established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers that they should teach them to their children, that the generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born, that they may arise and tell them to their children. Are you getting the picture here? Parents telling their children, who tell their children, who tell their children. That they should put their confidence in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments. You go ahead and you read the rest of Psalm 78, a rather lengthy psalm, 72 verses in all, and it's what is classified as a historical psalm because it recounts the great events and stories that we know from Old Testament history. But do you see what he's saying? You fathers, teach them to your children, and them to their children, and them to their children. Why? That they may put their confidence in God. Is it important that our children know the Bible stories? Yes, it's important. Why is it important? Because that is our God. It is the same God that we worship and serve today. It is the same God. And these children, they must be taught. They must learn, and they must know. And they must come to know God. You're going to teach your children best by living your faith. Children learn by parental modeling. You do a whole lot more teaching just going about your daily activities of life day after day after day than you do by sitting down and trying to give that very specific instruction. And they learn from you. And they learn from you whether or not faith is really real, whether it's a valid thing or when it's just something you do at specific times. You know, you go to the mall and you go to the ball game and you go play golf and you go shopping and you go to church and it's just one of the things on the list of things that you do. Or is your faith the foundation of your entire life? That the decisions you make are based upon your relationship with God through His Son? Are they seeing that your response to events and activities in life are spiritually driven? Or are they driven by whatever else? Back to the survey that I mentioned before. Fewer than half of the teens survey said their fathers took seriously letting Jesus be their Lord, or cared about spiritually lost or poor, or lived as if Jesus were coming soon. Fewer than half the teens said their fathers did that. We need to nurture in our children spiritual disciplines. Spiritual disciplines are the habitual practices that encourage and nurture spiritual development. Things like prayer, and things like Bible reading, and things like worship, and things like service. Nurture those within your children. Back to the survey again. 10 most important predictors of adolescent spiritual formation. Number 1, adolescent spiritual disciplines. Are your children learning that from you? That Bible reading is truly a significant part of your daily life? Let's go on. Don't have time to tell all those stories. You need to seize the teachable moment. Seize the teachable moment. Deuteronomy 6:7, you shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall talk to them when you sit in the house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. Man, that's all day long, isn't it? And every opportunity that comes along, you're teaching. Joshua chapter 4 and verse 6. When your children ask, they erected these monuments. They came across the River Jordan. Now, that's an obscure river, isn't it? They came across the River Jordan, and they collected a stone for every tribe, and they got on the other side, and they set up these stones as a little monument. And they said, when your children ask about this, you got something to tell them. When your children ask, you're teaching them. Why do we do what we do when we worship? When your children ask, you're ready to tell them. You seize the teachable moments. Sometimes those teachable moments are going to be based upon your own failings and shortcomings. Sometimes you're not going to respond as a parent in a Christian-like manner to certain situations or circumstances. Don't just let that blow by, but come back with your child when they've witnessed that and tell them, I made a mistake and I did wrong. I should not have responded the way I did in that situation. And here's what I should have done. And I ask your forgiveness for what I have done and being that kind of an example to you. Make it a teachable moment. Make the teachable moments the difficult experiences in your own child's life. What do you do when your child comes home and talks about how their friends are mistreating them? How they've got this lousy teacher that seems to have it in for them. Are we going to jump in and be the ones that are, poor child. You're being so mistreated and we just won't hang around those people anymore, and I'm going to see about getting you in a different class and have a teacher that likes you and treats you good? Or are we going to teach them how to deal with difficult people in life? Are we going to use those as opportunities to show them that there are some real challenges in dealing with people? And we need to work through this. And we need to handle this in a Christ-like manner. We need to seize the moments when we're watching television and talk about what we're seeing on the screen. I don't know if you know this or not, but it's not all good. But does your child know that it's not good? You need to create teachable moments. I am going to tell you another story. I told you about Chuck a while ago. He's a member there at South College, the one that just got out of prison. The Wednesday before he was to report to prison, there were people that were standing around after Wednesday night services, and I noticed our son was up there talking to Chuck. I thought, Dalton, I'm proud of you for doing that. Well, I found out later he did that because his mother said, Dalton, I really think that you ought to go talk to Chuck. This is going to be his last time here till he gets back out of prison. We went out to eat that night. There's a group of us, and I noticed that Dalton was nowhere around the table. Well, what happened there? Where did he go? And I went out to the van, and Dalton was in the van. And we just crying his eyes out. He said, I can't believe what's happening to Chuck and to Linda and to Zach and to Michaela. And his heart was just torn. But I guarantee you that boy is never, ever, ever going to forget that night. He's not going to forget that conversation. He's not going to forget what letting sin get the best of you will do to you. I'm going to protect him from that. But you create a teachable moment. I want to say a lot of other stuff. I think I'm actually over time. Well, he's giving me 1 minute. 1 minute. There is a list of resources that you haven't gotten yet. One side of the sheet is the goals, the spiritual goals. The other side is the resources. Okay. Oh, great. I want to draw your attention to one that's readily accessible right now, and that's the Little Acorn material. They have a website. They have a booth out here. Terrell Hatfield and his brother Justin wrote a daily devotional guide for families. And every day, there's the scripture reading for that day, and then there's a little devotional that you can go through with your kids. That's a tremendous resource. It's right out there. Go get it. And if you want some guidance in that regard for yourself, there's another book beside it. Happen to know the guy who wrote that one too. But it's for adults, daily devotional guide. But there are other resources there as well. I'd hope we'd had time to go through and talk about some of others that you may be aware of, but I talked way too long. Sorry about that. Glad that you're here. May God bless you as parents